It wasn't the voice that got me first. It wasn't the cold, sharp tone of someone telling me I didn't belong. No, it was the hand, that heavy, firm grip on my shoulder that felt like it was trying to push me back down into a history I thought I'd outrun. It was the kind of touch that doesn't just ask for your attention, it claims your dignity. I felt the weight of it through the fine wool of my blazer, a suit that cost more than my first 3 cars combined. And for a second, I wasn't a CEO. I wasn't a man who had built an empire from the red dirt of Georgia and the concrete of Detroit. I was just a target, a problem to be solved, a stain on the pristine, white leather reality of a first-class cabin at 30,000 feet. I want you to really picture this with me for a second. Imagine you've spent 20 years of your life sleeping 4 hours a night. Imagine you faced every no, every slammed door, and every you're not a good fit until your soul felt like it was made of nothing but scar tissue. You finally reach the summit. You're sitting in seat 1A. You've got a folder in your lap that contains the future of 5,000 families. 5,000 jobs in Chicago that depend on you showing up to a merger meeting and being the most composed, powerful man in the room. And then you feel that hand. You hear that air in the cabin just vanish, like the oxygen is a luxury meant for everyone else but you. Before I go any further into how this day turned into a nightmare, and then into the biggest bomb I ever dropped on a corporate ego, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a place where you did everything right? You worked hard. You paid your way. You followed every single rule. And yet, someone looked at you and decided you were a trespasser in your own life. I see you out there. I know some of you are listening to this in your car on the way to a job where they don't appreciate you. Some of you are in your living rooms, tired of fighting the same battles. Do me a favor. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Let me know I'm not just talking to the wind. Because what happened on this flight wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. The morning started like any other. I was up at 4:30 a.m. I did my reps in the gym, drank my black coffee, and kissed my wife. She straightened my tie and told me, "John, remember who you are. Don't let the pressure bend you." I laughed and told her I was made of iron. But iron can get cold. Man, especially when the world decides to throw ice on it. I checked into the airport with a quiet confidence. I like flying. I like the anonymity of the terminal. But I know the rules. I know that as a black man of my size and my age, I have to be twice as polite, 3 times as calm, and 4 times as prepared. I've lived my whole life by that math. I wore the charcoal suit, the one that makes me look like the authority I am. I had my documents in a leather briefcase that I've carried since I made my first million. It's my armor. When I walked onto that plane, I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for a few hours apiece so I could review the labor contracts for the Chicago plant. I wanted to make sure that those workers got their pensions. That was my mission. I settled into 1A. It's the best seat on this model of plane. You get the extra leg room, the first choice of the meal, and a bit of privacy from the rest of the world. I tucked my briefcase under the seat, adjusted my cuffs, and opened my laptop. I could hear the other passengers boarding behind me, the soft shuffle of feet, the rustle of jackets, the quiet murmurs of people complaining about the weather. It's a rhythmic sound, a hum of humanity that usually puts me at ease. Then I heard her. Sarah. She wasn't loud. She was that specific kind of polite that feels like a razor blade wrapped in silk. I watched her out of the corner of my eye as she greeted the couple behind me. They were a younger white couple, dressed in expensive athleisure, looking like they were headed to a vacation they'd already posted about on Instagram. She beamed at them. Her smile was wide, her eyes bright. She offered them champagne before they'd even sat down. "So good to have you with us, Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she chirped. Then she turned to me. The smile didn't just fade. It evaporated. It was like she'd suddenly walked into a wall of cold air. She didn't offer champagne. She didn't ask how my morning was. She just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, looking at my seat, then at me, then back at my seat. "Sir," she said. Her voice was flat. No music in it, just a question that sounded like a demand. I looked up from my laptop, giving her my most professional CEO smile, the one I use to close deals. "Yes. Can I help you with something? I think there's been a mistake," she said. She didn't look at my boarding pass, which was sitting right there on the armrest. She didn't even lean in to see my name. "This section is for first-class passengers only. The boarding for the main cabin is still ongoing. You need to head back through that curtain." I felt a familiar heat rise in my chest, but I pushed it down. I've practiced this. I know that if I get loud, I'm the aggressive one. If I get angry, I'm the threat. So I kept my voice low. I kept it smooth, like a river over stones. "I'm in first class, Sarah," I said, reading her name tag. "This is 1A. My boarding pass is right here." I gestured to the little slip of paper. She didn't pick it up. She barely glanced at it. "I'm sure you have a ticket, sir, but there's no way you're assigned to 1A. We had a high-profile booking for this seat. Maybe you're in 31A. People often get the numbers confused when they aren't used to flying these routes." The couple behind me, the Millers, stopped talking. I could feel their eyes on the back of my head. The silence in the cabin started to thicken. It's that heavy, suffocating silence where everyone is watching but no one is helping. It's the silence of a theater right before the tragedy starts. "I fly this route twice a month," I said, my voice still steady. "I am very familiar with the seating. I suggest you check your manifest again." "My name is John Carter," she scoffed. It was a small sound, but in that quiet cabin, it sounded like a gunshot. "Mr. Carter. I've been doing this for 10 years. I know who belongs in this cabin and who doesn't. You're disrupting the boarding process. Now, I can either help you find your correct seat in the back, or we can involve someone else. We wouldn't want to delay the flight for everyone else, would we?" She looked around at the Millers, seeking validation. The man, the husband, gave a small, awkward nod. He didn't know the facts, but he knew who he felt more comfortable with. He felt comfortable with Sarah. He felt uncomfortable with the large black man in the expensive suit who was causing a scene just by existing. "I'm not moving," I said. I didn't say it with malice. I said it as a fact, like saying the sky is blue. I paid for this seat. I earned this seat, and I'm going to stay in this seat. Sarah's face turned a shade of blotchy red. Her fake silk politeness was gone now. She leaned in closer, her voice a harsh whisper. "You people always think you can just bully your way into places. This isn't a street corner. Sir, this is a private airline. If you don't move right now, I will call security and have you removed for being non-compliant with crew instructions. Do you really want to spend your day in a holding cell?" I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes, not fear of me, but fear that her world wasn't as orderly as she thought. She couldn't wrap her mind around the idea that I might actually be exactly where I was supposed to be. To her, I was an anomaly, a mistake in the system. "Call them," I said. I went back to my laptop. I started reading a paragraph about health care benefits for the Chicago employees, but the words were blurring. My heart wasn't racing. I've been in high-stakes negotiations where billions were on the line, but my soul was heavy. I thought about my father. I thought about how he used to shine shoes in a building just like the one I now own. I thought about how he'd tell me to keep his head up, even when the weight of the world was trying to snap my neck. A few minutes passed. The rest of the passengers were still filing in, but the energy in first class was toxic. People were whispering. I heard the word trouble. I heard someone say, "Why does it always have to be a big deal?" Then, I heard the heavy thud of boots, not the soft-soled shoes of a flight attendant. These were boots meant for authority. I didn't look up until the shadow fell over my laptop screen. There were two of them. Security officers from the airport. They looked young, fit, and very ready. Behind them stood a man in a pilot's uniform, not the captain, but a younger co-pilot or a first officer. He had his arms crossed, looking at me with a mix of boredom and irritation. "Is there a problem here?" the lead officer asked. He didn't ask Sarah. He didn't ask the captain. He asked me. But his tone said he already knew the answer. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling with a performative kind of victimhood. "Officer, I've asked this gentleman multiple times to move to his correct seat. He's being extremely difficult and making the other passengers uncomfortable. He's refusing to show proper identification or follow my instructions." That was a lie. A flat-out, bold-faced lie. I had offered my pass. I had given my name. But in that moment, her lie was the truth because it fit the narrative they all wanted to believe. The officer looked at me. "Sir, step out into the aisle. We need to see some ID in your boarding pass. Now, I'm happy to show you my ID," I said, reaching into my jacket. Slowly, the second officer barked, his hand moving toward his belt. I froze. My hand was halfway to my pocket. I looked at the officer. I saw the tension in his jaw. I saw the way his fingers twitched near his holster. In that split second, the CEO title meant nothing. The merger meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was that I didn't make a sudden move. "My ID is in my inside pocket," I said, my voice as calm as a prayer. "I'm going to reach for it now. Do you understand?" The officer nodded curtly. I pulled out my wallet and handed him my driver's license and my black corporate card. He took them, glanced at them, and then looked at Sarah. "He says his name is John Carter." The officer said, "Anyone can have a fake ID." Sarah snapped. "And look at this boarding pass. It's probably a screenshot or a counterfeit. We have a VIP manifest. Mr. Carter is not on the list I was given." The first officer, the one from the flight crew, stepped in. "Look, man," he said, trying to act like he was doing me a favor. "Let's not make this a thing. We've got a schedule to keep. Just grab your bag, head to the back, and we can sort this out on the ground in Chicago. If there was a mistake, the airline will give you a voucher or something. But right now, you're interfering with flight operations." "I'm not interfering with anything," I said. "I'm sitting in my seat. If you want to move me, you're going to have to do it by force. And I want everyone in this cabin to watch. I want every one of those phones I see pointing at me to record exactly what happens when a man pays for a service and is treated like a criminal because he doesn't fit the profile." I looked around. Sure enough, at least 5 phones were up. The Millers were recording. A woman across the aisle was recording. I didn't care. I wanted the world to see. The lead security officer sighed. It was a sound of someone who had lost his patience. He reached out and grabbed my shoulder. That was the touch I told you about. That heavy, dismissive grip. Sir, I'm giving you one last warning. Get up, or we will assist you off this plane. I looked at the hand on my shoulder. I looked at the expensive fabric of my suit being bunched up under his fingers. I felt the indignity of it all. The years of struggle, the sacrifices, the broken glass I'd had to walk over to get to this seat. All of it being dismissed by a man who didn't even know my middle name. I didn't get up. I didn't fight. I just sat there. I felt the anger. Yes, but more than that, I felt a deep, profound sadness. This was America in 2026. A man can own the building, but he still can't sit in the chair without being questioned. You're making a mistake, I said softly. No, Sarah whispered, leaning in so only I could hear her. You made the mistake of thinking you belonged here. She signaled to the officers. The lead guard tightened his grip, his knuckles turning white. He leaned his weight into me, preparing to yank me out of the seat. I could feel the eyes of the entire cabin on me, some filled with pity, some with a sick kind of excitement, and some with the same cold disdain as Sarah. I didn't move. I braced myself against the armrests, my fingers digging into the leather. I looked straight ahead, past the officers, past the fearful flight attendant, and stared at the cockpit door. I wasn't just waiting for them to pull me. I was waiting for the moment the world would realize exactly who they were touching. The officer's other hand came down on my opposite arm, and he began to pull. I felt my body lift an inch off the seat. The cabin was deathly silent, except for the hum of the engines and the sound of my own steady breath. I looked at the captain's door one last time, my jaw set, my mind sharp as a razor, as the officer prepared to drag me into the aisle. The upward pull of those two men was more than a physical force. It was a gravity I'd been fighting since I was 7 years old. As they tried to hoist me out of that seat, I felt every dollar I'd ever earned, every late-night flight I'd taken to build my company, and every sacrifice my parents made, all being compressed into a single moment of absolute indignity. I could hear the fabric of my blazer straining, that charcoal wool I'd chosen specifically because it looked unshakable, and it felt like the system itself was trying to tear the skin right off my back. I didn't struggle. I didn't swing. I just made myself heavy, not just physically heavy, but spiritually heavy. I became a mountain they couldn't move, a monument to a truth they weren't ready to face. The lead officer's breath was hot against the side of my neck, smelling of stale peppermint and nervous sweat. He was grunt-heaving now, surprised that a man sitting down could offer so much resistance without even moving a muscle. Behind him, I could see Sarah's face. She wasn't just annoyed anymore. She was vibrating with a sick kind of anticipation. She wanted to see me on the floor. She wanted to see the problem drag down the aisle so she could go back to serving warm nuts and champagne to the people she deemed worthy. It's funny how a moment like that can stretch into a lifetime. While they were tugging at my arms, my mind didn't stay in that cabin. It drifted back to a rainy Tuesday in Detroit. 35 years ago, I remember the smell of that day so clearly. Damp concrete, exhaust fumes from the Ford plant, and the scent of my father's old work jacket. My dad, Otis, was a man who never raised his voice, but his silence could fill a cathedral. He worked 30 years at that plant, his hands permanently stained with grease and oil that no amount of gojo could ever truly wash away. I remember him sitting me down at our small kitchen table, the yellow linoleum cracked at the edges. He'd just come home from a shift. His back stooped like he was carrying the weight of the whole city. He pulled out a small, tattered leather wallet, and laid his ID, his union card, and a folded-up receipt on the table. He looked me dead in the eye, his gaze like tempered steel. "John," he said, his voice low and raspy, "in this country, they're going to look at you and see a shadow before they see a man. They're going to ask for your papers when they don't ask anyone else. They're going to question your right to breathe the same air. So, you keep your receipts, you keep your head up, and you never, ever give them the satisfaction of seeing you bend." I felt that receipt in my spirit right then. Sitting in 1A, I was the manifestation of my father's wildest dreams. And yet, here I was, facing the same ghost he'd fought his whole life. It's a weary realization. Realizing that all the money in the world can't buy you out of a certain kind of narrow-mindedness. It's like trying to pay a debt in a currency the collector refuses to recognize. "Sir, you are making this very difficult for yourself," the second officer barked. He was younger, his face flushed with a mix of adrenaline and embarrassment because he couldn't budge a middle-aged man. He shifted his grip, grabbing my forearm so hard I knew there would be bruises by the time I landed in Chicago. I didn't look at him. I looked at Sarah. "The difficulty isn't coming from me," I said. My voice was a calm, resonant bass that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "The difficulty is coming from the fact that you've decided my presence is an error. You're trying to delete a person who paid for his place." Just then, a new player entered the stage. A young man, maybe in his late 20s, wearing the crisp white shirt and epaulettes of a first officer, stepped through the curtain from the galley. Let's call him Brian. Brian had that look, that groomed, Ivy League adjacent, born on third base arrogance that usually settles in the boardrooms I haunt. He didn't look concerned. He looked bored. He leaned against the bulkhead, crossing his arms, a small, condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Come on, big guy," Brian said, his voice dripping with that faux familiarity people use when they want to diminish you. "Let's not do the whole civil rights routine today. We've got a window to hit, and the tower is breathing down our necks. Just head back to coach. We'll get you a couple of extra bags of pretzels and maybe a refund on the Wi-Fi. It's not that deep. It's not that deep." The words felt like a slap. To him, this was a minor scheduling glitch. To me, it was a fundamental assault on my personhood. Is that the official policy of this airline? "Brian," I asked, my eyes locking onto his, "that when a passenger is harassed and racially profiled, the solution is pretzels." His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. He wasn't used to people talking back to him with that kind of vocabulary. "Look, bud, I don't care about your politics. I care about my flight deck. You're a disruption. Sarah says you're in the wrong seat. So you're in the wrong seat. Move, or we'll have the officers use the taser. Your choice." Behind me, in the elite section of the cabin, I heard a snicker. I turned my head just enough to see the tech bros I'd noticed earlier. They were both holding their iPhones up, laughing quietly to themselves. One of them, a guy with a backwards hat and a shirt that probably cost $500 but looked like a rag, whispered something to his friend about equity hires. They were enjoying the show. To them, I was just content. I was a 30-second clip for their followers to mock. A Karen video in reverse, edited to make me look like the villain. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. These were the people I competed with in the market. These were the people who used my company's software to build their platforms. And here they were, recording my humiliation like it was a halftime show at a ball game. I felt a surge of something hot and sharp in my gut, not just anger. but a righteous fury that had been simmering for decades. Sarah saw my reaction and seemed to find her second wind. She stepped forward again, sensing that with Brian and the officers there. She was untouchable. She reached out and snatched my boarding pass and my ID right out of the officer's hand. "This is clearly a fake," she said, her voice rising so the whole cabin could hear. She held my black corporate card up like it was a piece of trash she'd found under a seat. "I mean, look at this. Who are you trying to kid? You probably found this or stole it. A man like you, running a company like this. It's laughable." She didn't just say it. She believed it. In her mind, the only way a man who looked like me could have that card was through some act of dishonesty. The idea that I could be the one who signed the checks, the one who navigated the boardrooms, was so foreign to her that it was impossible. "Give me my property." "Sarah," I said. My voice had lost its warmth. It was now as cold as the air outside the plane at 30,000 feet. "You want it," she sneered. She didn't hand it back. She didn't put it on the armrest. She took my driver's license, my boarding pass, and my corporate card, and she tossed them. She didn't just drop them. She threw them toward the floor. I watched in slow motion as the plastic and paper fluttered through the air, sliding under the seat of the tech bros in 2A. "There," she said, her hands on her hips. "Now, officers, get this man off my plane. I'm done being polite." The sound of my ID hitting the carpet was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It was a sharp, final clack that echoed in the marrow of my bones. It was the sound of the last bridge burning. In that moment, the CEO, the man who worried about mergers and P&L statements and public relations, he stepped out of the room. He walked away and left behind the man my father raised. The man who knew that sometimes peace isn't an option. Sometimes you have to let the storm break so people can see how much damage it can do. I felt the lead officer's grip tighten again. He was going for a pain compliance hold, twisting my wrist in a way that was meant to force me to stand up. The pain was there, a white-hot spike traveling up my arm, but it felt distant. It felt like it was happening to someone else. I was too focused on the image of my father's ID on that yellow linoleum table. I was too focused on the fact that I had spent my whole life trying to be one of the good ones, only to realize that to people like Sarah and Brian, there was no such thing. I turned my head and looked at the tech bro who was sitting near where my ID had landed. He looked down at the cards on the floor, then up at me, and he actually smirked. He didn't pick them up. He kicked them further under his seat with his expensive sneaker. "Seems like you lost something, big guy," he whispered, loud enough for Brian to hear. Brian chuckled. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I just felt a terrifying kind of clarity. I knew exactly what I was about to do. I knew that within 24 hours. This airline would be in a free fall. I knew that the bomb I was about to drop wasn't a physical one, but it would be just as devastating. It was a bomb made of ownership, of law, and of the absolute power that comes when you realize you don't have to ask for permission to exist in a space you already own. The officer pulled harder, his face turning purple with the effort. "Stand up. Stand up now, or you're going down." I didn't stand. Instead, I reached into the small, hidden pocket of my briefcase, the one I kept for emergencies. I didn't pull out a weapon. I pulled out my phone. It was a secure line, encrypted, the one I used for the most sensitive negotiations of my career. Sarah saw the phone and let out a shrill laugh. "Oh, what? You're going to call your lawyer, or maybe your boss. Go ahead. Call whoever you want. By the time they pick up, You'll be in the terminal in handcuffs. I'm not calling a lawyer. Sarah, I said, my voice so quiet it forced everyone to lean in to hear it. I'm calling the person who decides if this plane even has fuel for its next leg. I tapped a single name on my contact list. Marcus. Marcus wasn't just my assistant. He was my tactical lead. He was the man who handled the dirty work of acquisitions. The one who made sure the transitions were seamless and the old guard was swept out with the trash. I'd sent him a text 10 minutes ago, but this was the follow-up. The go signal. The phone rang once. Sir. Marcus's voice was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. He was in New York, probably sitting in an office that overlooked the park, surrounded by screens and data. Marcus, I said, my gaze never leaving Sarah's eyes. The regional carrier. Skyline. The one we finished the paperwork on yesterday. The one we weren't supposed to announce until the merger in Chicago. Yes, sir. Everything is signed, sealed, and delivered. You are the majority shareholder as of 5:00 p.m. yesterday. You effectively own the operating certificates for the entire fleet. Good, I said. I want you to initiate the cultural integrity clause. Immediately, I'm on flight 1042. I want a full lockdown of the crew's credentials. I want the captain notified that his commanding officer is currently being assaulted in seat 1A. And Marcus, sir, tell the legal team to prepare the severance packages for the entire flight crew. But don't make them generous. Make them the bare minimum allowed by law. We're cleaning house. The cabin was silent. I could hear the air conditioning vents hissing. I could hear the distant cry of a baby in the back of the plane. But in first class, it was like the world had stopped spinning. Sarah's smirk didn't just disappear. It crumbled. She looked at me, then at the phone, then at Brian. Brian had gone from leaning against the bulkhead to standing up straight, his face suddenly as white as his shirt. He was smart enough to recognize the names I was dropping. He knew about the Skyline acquisition. It had been the biggest rumor in the industry for months. Wait, Brian stammered, his voice cracking. What? What did you just say? I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. The security officer, still holding my arm, hesitated. He looked at Brian, looking for a signal. He was confused. He'd been told I was a trespasser, but the way I was talking, it didn't sound like a man who was lying. It sounded like a man who was issuing an execution order. I looked down at the officer's hand on my charcoal suit. You should probably let go of me now, I said, because in about 30 seconds, your supervisor is going to get a call that's going to make him wonder why he hired you. The officer's grip loosened, just a fraction, but it was enough. I pulled my arm back, smoothed the fabric of my sleeve, and sat back in my seat. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a king who had just decided to stop being merciful. Sarah was shaking now, truly shaking. She reached out toward the tech bro's seat, her fingers fumbling as she tried to reach for my ID and the black card she'd thrown on the floor. She was trying to undo the moment, trying to climb back across the bridge she'd just blown up. Mr. Carter. First. I didn't realize. I was just following the manifest. Her voice was a pathetic whisper, a far cry from the sharp, mocking tone she'd used just seconds ago. Don't, I said. She froze. Don't touch my property, I said, my eyes like twin coals. You've done enough. You wanted to see me out of this seat. You wanted to see me gone. Well, you're about to get your wish. But I won't be the only one leaving. The cockpit door, the one I'd been staring at, suddenly flew open. Captain Peterson stepped out. He wasn't the first officer. He was the man in charge. He was older, with graying temples and a face that had seen 1,000,000 miles of sky. He looked around the cabin, his eyes wide, his breathing heavy. He looked at the security officers, then at the tech bros, then at Sarah, who was practically shrinking into the carpet. Finally, his eyes landed on me. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his hand trembling as he held his headset. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost, or worse. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the deck of a sinking ship. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just felt that deep, cold weight in my chest. I thought about my father again. I thought about how he never got to see a day like this. A day where the receipts actually mattered. A day where the shadow finally became the man. I reached down and picked up my briefcase, placing it firmly on my lap. I didn't look at the officers. I didn't look at Brian. I kept my eyes on Peterson. "Captain," I said, the word ringing through the cabin like a bell. "I believe you have a phone call to take." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it was pressing me back into the leather of the seat. As everyone in the cabin, from the tech bros to the security guards, waited for the first sound from the captain's lips to tell them if their world was still standing. The captain's hand didn't just tremble. It looked like it was trying to detach itself from his arm. He gripped that plastic headset so hard, I thought I heard the casing snap. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a man who'd spent a month in a basement. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't look at Brian. He looked at me. And for the first time since I'd stepped onto this aircraft, I wasn't a subject or a problem. I was a nightmare he'd spent his entire career trying to avoid. The silence in that first-class cabin was so absolute you could hear the microscopic whine of the electronics in the galley. It wasn't just a lack of noise. It was a physical weight, a vacuum that sucked the air right out of your lungs. The security officer who had been trying to yank me out of my seat had frozen mid-motion. His fingers were still hooked under my arm, but the strength had vanished from them. He looked up at Captain Peterson, waiting for a command that wasn't coming. I didn't move. I didn't adjust my suit. I just sat there in the middle of that storm, feeling the familiar, cold clarity of a man who has already won the war and is just waiting for the smoke to clear. This is what I call boardroom mode. It's a place I go when the stakes are so high that emotion becomes a liability. I start auditing. I start counting. I was mentally logging the number of seconds Peterson stood there paralyzed. I was noting the exact angle of Sarah's jaw as it hung open. I was recording the way the light from the small window caught the dust motes dancing in the air. The only things in this cabin that were still free to move. "Peterson," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The man on the other end of that line isn't a lawyer. He's the architect of your future. I suggest you listen very carefully to what he has to tell you. Peterson swallowed. I watched his Adam's apple bob up and down, a rhythmic sign of a man drowning in his own choices. He slowly raised the headset back to his ear, his eyes never leaving mine. He listened for a long, agonizing minute. I could hear a faint, distorted voice coming through the earpiece. Marcus's voice. It was sharp, clinical, and final. I knew exactly what Marcus was telling him. He was explaining that as of 5:00 p.m. the previous day, the board of directors of Skyline Airlines had been dissolved and replaced by a transitional team headed by me. He was telling Peterson that every pilot, every attendant, and every ground crew member was now under a probationary cultural review. And he was telling him that the man he was currently trying to drag off the plane was the man who owned the very air he was breathing. As the captain listened, the energy in the cabin began to shift. It was like a tide turning in the middle of the night. The passengers, the tech bros, the Millers, the woman in 3B, they could all feel it. They didn't know the specifics yet, but they knew the predator had just become the prey. The woman in 3B, a silver-haired lady who had been watching with tears of frustration in her eyes, suddenly stood up. Her voice was thin but steady, cutting through the stagnant air like a bell. "This is enough," she cried out. "I've been sitting here watching you people treat this man like he's a criminal. He's done nothing but sit there with more dignity than any of you deserve. If you touch him again, I'm calling the police myself the moment we land." It was the crack in the dam. A man across the aisle, who had been burying his face in a tablet, looked up and nodded. "She's right. This is disgusting. I've never seen anything like it. You tossed his ID on the floor. Who does that?" I looked at the floor. My driver's license and that black card were still tucked under the tech bro sneaker. He saw me looking. The smirk he'd been wearing was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked realization. He realized that the content he was filming was about to become a liability. He quickly pulled his foot back, as if the cards were made of hot coals. He reached down, fumbled with them, and tried to hand them back to me with a shaking hand. "Hey, man. First, I didn't see them there. I thought. I was just—" "Don't," I said. My voice was a flat line. "You liked it better when they were under your shoe. Keep that same energy." I didn't take the cards. I let them sit there on the carpet, a silent testament to the indignity I'd just endured. I wanted them to stay there. I wanted everyone to have to look at them. Sarah, the flight attendant, was backed against the bulkhead now. Her hands were pressed against the plastic paneling as if she were trying to push herself through the wall of the plane. The VIP manifest she'd been weaponizing was clutched in her hand, crumpled and useless. She looked at Brian, the first officer, begging for him to say something, to fix it, to tell her it was all a mistake. But Brian was gone. Not physically. He was still standing there, but his spirit had checked out. He was staring at the floor, his face the color of wet ash. He knew the industry. He knew that in a world of mergers and acquisitions, people like me were the gods of the mountain, and he had just told a god to head to Coach for some pretzels. Captain Peterson finally lowered the headset. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 minutes. He stepped forward, his boots making a heavy, hollow sound on the carpet. He waved his hand at the security officers, a desperate, frantic gesture. "Get out!" Peterson whispered. The lead officer blinked, confused. "Sir, I said get out. Off the plane. Now." Peterson's voice cracked, rising to a panicked shout. The 2 guards didn't ask questions. They saw the terror in their captain's eyes and they bolted. They didn't just walk. They practically ran up the jet bridge, disappearing into the terminal like they were escaping a burning building. The cabin was quiet again, but the hum of the engines felt louder now, like the heartbeat of a beast waking up. Peterson turned to me. He took off his cap and held it in both hands, a gesture of submission that was almost painful to watch. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice trembling. "First, I had no idea. There was a breakdown in communication. The manifest wasn't updated. The transition team didn't notify the regional flight decks. I'm so incredibly sorry for the misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" I asked. I stood up then. I'm a big man, and when I stand up in a confined space, like a first-class cabin, I take up all the room. I stood to my full height, smoothing the front of my blazer. I looked down at Peterson, not with anger, but with a cold, clinical curiosity. Is that what you call it when your crew lies about a passenger's behavior? Is that what you call it when my legal identification is treated like trash? Is that a misunderstanding of procedure? Or is it a understanding of how you think the world works? Sir, please, Peterson stammered. We can fix this. We can relocate the other passengers. We can give you the entire row. We can. You can't do anything. Peterson, I interrupted. You lost the right to fix this the moment you walked out of that cockpit and looked at me as a disruption instead of a human being. You're a pilot. Your job is to assess facts. You ignored every fact presented to you because they didn't match the picture in your head. I turned my gaze to Sarah. She looked like she was about to faint. The arrogance that had been her armor was gone, leaving behind a terrified woman who realized she'd just set fire to her own life. And you, I said, my voice dropping to that low. Dangerous register. You told me I didn't belong here. You told me this wasn't a street corner. I want you to think about that phrase for the rest of your life. Because while you were busy trying to figure out which street corner I came from, I was busy signing the paperwork that owns the very chair you're standing in. I look back at Peterson. This flight isn't going anywhere. Not with this crew. Mr. Carter, please, Peterson pleaded. We have a full flight. People have connections. We have families in the back. I know exactly who is in the back. Captain, I said, and I won't have them flown by a crew that thinks procedure is a weapon to be used against people they don't like. You're grounded. The entire crew. Marcus is already coordinating with the FAA and the local terminal. A replacement crew is being bussed over from the international hub. It'll take 2 hours. The groan that went through the cabin was expected, but it was short-lived. The woman in 3B stood up again and started clapping. Then the man across the aisle joined in. Soon, half the first-class cabin was applauding. It wasn't the kind of applause you get at a show. It was the sound of people seeing something right happen in a world that usually goes wrong. But I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt weary. I felt the weight of my father's ghost on my shoulder, reminding me that even when you win, the cost is always too high. I looked down at the tech bros. They were still holding their phones, but they weren't laughing anymore. They looked terrified that I was going to turn my attention to them next. Delete the videos, I said to them. What? The one in the hat asked. You heard me. Delete them. You didn't film this because you cared about justice. You filmed it because you thought it was funny. I don't want my face on your content platforms. If I see a single frame of this on the internet, my legal team will spend the next 10 years making sure your startup never sees another dime of VC funding. Do I make myself clear? They didn't hesitate. I watched their thumbs fly across the screens, deleting the files. They were cowards. Most bullies are. They only have power when they think no one can fight back. I turned back to my briefcase. I sat back down, not because I had to, but because I chose to. I opened the folder I'd been trying to read since the beginning. The labor contracts for the Chicago plant. I looked at the names of the workers. People who worked hard, who had families, who deserved to be treated with respect. That was the mission. That was the only thing that mattered. Peterson was still standing there, clutching his hat. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but he knew there were no words left. He'd used them all up on the wrong side of history. He slowly turned and walked back toward the cockpit. His shoulders slumped, his spirit broken. Brian followed him, not saying a word. He didn't even look at Sarah as he passed her. He was already thinking about his resume. about how he was going to explain being fired for cause from a major carrier. Sarah was left standing alone in the aisle. She looked at me, her eyes red and puffy. "First, I have a daughter," she whispered. I didn't look up from my folder. "Then, you should have thought about the example you were setting for her before you decided to throw a man's life on the floor." The coldness in my own voice surprised me, but it wasn't a cruelty. It was a consequence. For too long, people like Sarah had operated under the assumption that their politeness could mask their poison. They thought that as long as they wore a uniform and followed a manifest, they could treat people like me however they wanted. Well, the manifest had changed. I sat there for the next hour as the plane sat at the gate. The cabin was quiet now, a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a waiting room. The passengers spoke in hushed tones. The Millers didn't say a word to each other. Sarah had disappeared into the galley, and I could hear the muffled sound of her sobbing. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the plane's auxiliary power unit, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. It felt like a ticking clock. I thought about the cultural integrity clause. I'd had my lawyers write it into the acquisition specifically for this reason. Skyline had a history of incidents. There were lawsuits, complaints, and a general sense that the airline was stuck in a bygone era. I'd bought it because I wanted to change that. I wanted to build an airline where the person in 1A and the person in 31E were treated with the same fundamental human decency. I just didn't expect to have to test the clause myself on day one. My phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "Replacement crew has arrived at the gate. FAA has cleared the swap. Legal has the termination papers ready for Peterson, Harris, and Miller. The board is on standby for your arrival in Chicago." I closed my laptop and tucked it into my briefcase. I stood up one last time. I didn't look at Sarah as I walked past the galley. I didn't look at the captain as he stood by the door, watching his replacement walk onto the bridge. I walked to the front of the plane, to the jet bridge door. I needed to breathe some air that hadn't been recycled through a system that didn't want me. I stepped out of the cabin and onto the carpeted ramp of the terminal. The new crew was waiting there, a diverse group of men and women who looked professional, alert, and genuinely surprised to see me. The new captain, a woman with sharp eyes and a firm handshake, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm Captain Miller. We're ready to take you to Chicago. We've been briefed on the situation. It won't happen again. I know it won't." "Captain," I said, "because from now on, the manifest isn't just a list of names. It's a list of people, and we're going to remember that." I turned back to look at the plane one last time. I could see the silhouette of the old crew being escorted off through the service door on the other side. They were leaving quietly, their heads down. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of my father. I could see him standing at that kitchen table, his grease-stained hands resting on the linoleum. I could hear his voice, clear as a bell in my mind. "You keep your receipts. John, you keep your head up." I reached into my pocket and felt my driver's license and that black card. I hadn't picked them up. Captain Miller had retrieved them for me and handed them over. With a nod of respect, I ran my thumb over the embossed letters of my name. John Carter, CEO. Man. I walked back onto the plane. But I didn't go to first class. I walked past the curtain, past the row where the tech bros sat staring at their laps, and kept going. I walked all the way to the back of the plane, to the very last row of coach. The passengers back there looked at me with curiosity. They didn't know who I was. They hadn't seen the drama in the front. To them, I was just a man in a nice suit walking down the aisle. I found an empty middle seat next to a young man who was wearing a worn-out hoodie and reading a textbook on mechanical engineering. He looked up at me, surprised that someone in a suit would choose to sit there. "Is this seat taken?" I asked. No." "Go ahead, man," he said, shifting his bag to give me room. I sat down. The seat was cramped. My knees hit the back of the chair in front of me. The air was a little warmer, and the smell of the cabin was a mix of coffee and too many people in a small space. It was uncomfortable. It was loud. It was real. "You're in the wrong place, aren't you?" the young man asked, gesturing to my suit. "First class is up there." I looked at him and smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches your eyes. "No," I said, leaning my head back against the thin, scratchy fabric of the headrest. "I'm exactly where I need to be." As the engines began to roar for takeoff, I felt the vibration of the plane through the floorboards, a powerful, surging force that promised to lift us all into the sky, regardless of who we were or where we sat. And I closed my eyes, letting the pressure of the ascent press me deep into the seat. The rattle of the cabin in the back of the plane is different from the front. In first class, the engines purr like a distant, well-behaved cat. But back here in the last row, the world sounds like it's being torn apart by a hurricane. Every bolt, every plastic panel, every overhead bin seemed to be vibrating in a frantic, metallic rhythm as we climbed through the clouds. I felt the G-force pressing my chest into that cramped middle seat. But for the first time in years, the pressure didn't feel like an attack. It felt like a tether. I looked at the young man next to me, the engineering student. He was staring out the window, his eyes wide with the raw excitement of someone who hadn't yet been told where he was allowed to go. "First time," I shouted over the roar of the ascent. He looked over, startled, then grinned. "Fifth time, but I'll never get used to the physics of it. All that weight, just defying everything." I nodded, leaning my head against the vibrating wall. "Defying everything. That's the only way to get anywhere worth going, son." As the fasten seatbelt sign finally chimed off, and the plane leveled out at 30,000 feet, the silence that followed wasn't the suffocating vacuum I'd experienced in the front of the plane. It was a working silence, the sound of 300 people breathing, rustling papers, and trying to find a comfortable way to exist in an uncomfortable space. I sat there, my $3,000 suit getting wrinkled by the narrow armrests, and I realized that I had spent so much of my life trying to get away from the back of the plane that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be among the people I was actually working for. I pulled out my phone as soon as the Wi-Fi connected. The bomb had already detonated. The screen was a blur of notifications. Skyline shock was the #1 trending topic in the United States. I didn't even have to look for the video. It was everywhere. There was Sarah, her face contorted in that ugly sneer as she tossed my ID onto the floor. There was the lead officer, his knuckles white as he tried to yank me from my seat. And there was the silence of the cabin, the silence that I knew would haunt the board of directors more than the shouting ever could. I scrolled through the comments. Thousands of people, black, white, Latino, Asian, all sharing their own receipts. Stories of being followed in stores, of being told they were in the wrong neighborhood, of being made to feel like a trespasser in their own skin. I saw a message from a woman in Atlanta. "I stopped flying Skyline 5 years ago because of this. Thank you for not moving." I felt a lump in my throat. I hadn't moved for myself. Not really. I'd moved for my father. I'd move for this kid next to me with the engineering textbook. I'd move because the cultural integrity clause wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a promise I'd made to the kid I used to be, the one who thought he had to apologize for being in the room. The descent into Chicago was smooth, but the atmosphere at O'Hare was anything but. As we taxied toward the gate, I could see the flashing lights of airport police and the black SUVs of my security detail idling on the tarmac. Word had traveled. The regional office of Skyline knew their new boss was on a plane that they had turned into a crime scene. I stayed in my seat until everyone else had deplaned. I watched the passengers file past, their faces tired but curious. Some of them looked at me, their eyes lingering on my suit, then on my face. They recognized me now. The woman from 3B stopped at the back of the plane, her hand resting on the headrest of my seat. "I'm glad you stayed," she whispered, her eyes shining. "Don't let them take your peace. They can't take what they didn't give me." "Ma'am," I said softly, when I finally stepped off that aircraft and into the jet bridge. The air felt different. It was Chicago air, sharp, cold, and smelling of Lake Michigan and ambition. At the end of the tunnel stood Marcus, my assistant, and Rachel, our head of legal. Rachel looked like she hadn't slept, but her eyes were like twin lasers. "Sir," Marcus said, taking my briefcase. He didn't ask how I was. He knew. "The car is ready. The board is waiting at the headquarters on Wacker Drive." They tried to cancel the meeting, but I reminded them that the owner of the company doesn't take no for an answer. "Good," I said. "Is the footage prepared?" Rachel stepped forward, her heels clicking on the tile. "We have the original raw files from 4 different passengers. We've also subpoenaed the internal cabin audio. It's worse than the viral clips. John, Sarah Harris had been complaining about suspicious passengers to the cockpit for 20 minutes before she even spoke to you. She'd been building a case against you from the moment you walked through the door." I felt a coldness settle in my bones. It wasn't just a snap judgment. It was a project. She had been working on my removal like it was a chore she needed to finish. "Let's go," I said. The drive through Chicago was a blur of gray stone and glass. I watched the city fly by, thinking about the meeting I was supposed to have, the merger that would save 5,000 jobs. Those jobs were still on the line, but now they were tied to something bigger. I wasn't just merging 2 companies. I was merging 2 realities. We pulled up to the Skyline corporate headquarters. The glass tower was a monument to old-school corporate power, all marble floors and silent elevators. As I walked through the lobby, the security guards stood a little straighter. They didn't ask for my ID. They didn't question my presence. The screen in the lobby was playing the news, and my face was on it. We reached the 54th floor. The doors opened to a hallway that smelled of expensive silence and fear. I could see the board members through the glass walls of the conference room. There were 12 of them, all men, mostly older, sitting around a mahogany table that looked like it had been carved from the remains of a sunken ship. At the head of the table sat Richard. Richard was the senior-most member, the one who had run Skyline like a private club for 30 years. He looked at me as I entered, his face a mask of practiced concern. "John," he said, standing up and extending a hand. "What a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. We are already drafting a public apology. We've put the crew on administrative leave. We'll make this right." I didn't take his hand. I sat down at the opposite end of the table, Marcus and Rachel flanking me. I took a slow breath, letting the silence of the room stretch until it became uncomfortable. A misunderstanding. Richard, I asked. My voice was a calm, resonant bass that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. A misunderstanding is when you get a coffee order wrong. A misunderstanding is when a flight is delayed by weather. What I experienced today was a policy. It was a culture. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Another board member named Henderson chimed in. That was one flight attendant who overstepped. We can't blame the entire organization for the actions of one stressed employee. I looked at Rachel. She nodded and tapped a button on her tablet. The massive screen at the end of the room flashed to life. It wasn't the viral video. It was a chart. An audit of passenger removals over the last 5 years at Skyline. In the last 60 months, I said, my eyes moving from one board member to the next. Skyline has removed 400 passengers for non-compliance. 78% of those passengers were people of color. Of those, 60% were sitting in first or business class. Do you want to tell me again that it's just one stressed employee? The room went deathly silent. Richard cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the graph. John, we were unaware of these specific metrics. We focus on the bottom line, on the safety of the fleet. I'm the bottom line now. Richard, I said, leaning forward. I placed my black corporate card, the one Sarah had tossed on the floor, in the center of the mahogany table. It looked small against the wood, but it carried the weight of the entire building. And safety doesn't just mean the engines aren't on fire. It means a man can sit in the seat he paid for without having a taser pointed at his chest, just because he doesn't look the part. I stood up and began walking around the table. All of you knew about the cultural integrity clause in the acquisition. You thought it was just fluff. You thought it was something I put in there to satisfy the PR department. But here's how it works. Under this clause, any evidence of systemic bias within the leadership or operational crew of this airline constitutes a breach of the merger agreement. It gives me the power to dissolve the board and restructure the executive team without a vote. Richard's face turned from gray to a sickly, pale white. You can't be serious. You're talking about a hostile takeover of the leadership based on one flight. I'm talking about a hostile takeover of a toxic culture. I corrected him. As of this moment, I am exercising that clause. Rachel has the papers right here. All of you are being relieved of your duties, effective immediately. You'll receive your base severance, no bonuses, no golden parachutes. The money we save on your exit packages will go directly into a fund to retrain every single employee, from the pilots to the baggage handlers. You're destroying this company, Henderson shouted, slamming his fist on the table. Number, I said, stopping behind his chair. I'm saving it, because a company that treats its owners like criminals and its customers like burdens doesn't deserve to exist in the first place. I walked over to the window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows over the city. I thought about my father's hands, the grease, the oil, the receipts. I realized that receipts aren't just for the things we've bought. They are for the things we paid for with our sweat, blood, and dignity. Get out, I said without turning around. I heard the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. I heard the muffled whispers, heavy sighs, and finally, the sound of the mahogany doors closing. Marcus stepped up beside me. The press is waiting downstairs. Sir, they want a statement. The viral video already has 10 million views. I turned back to the room. It was empty now. Just a large table in a cold room. Tell them I'm coming down, I said. But tell them I'm not making a corporate statement. I'm telling a story. I walked out of that boardroom, down the silent hallway, and into the elevator. When the doors opened in the lobby, the wall of camera flashes was blinding. There were hundreds of people, reporters, activists, and even some Skyline employees who had heard the news. I stepped up to the microphone. I didn't have a teleprompter. I didn't have a script. I only had the memory of that hand on my shoulder and the rattling at the back of the plane. "My name is John Carter," I began, my voice steady and clear, reaching the back of the room. And today, I was told I didn't belong in first class. But the truth is, I don't belong in a world that demands your permission to be respected. Today, Skyline Airlines is changing, not because we have a new owner, but because we have a new heart. We are going to remember that every seat on our planes is occupied by a human being with a story, a family, and a right to be there. I looked directly into the lens of the main camera, thinking about you, the person listening to this right now. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that your seat is yours. Whether you're in the front of the plane or the very last row, you have earned your place in this world. Don't let anyone, not a flight attendant, not a boss, not a stranger on the street, tell you that you're a trespasser. Keep your receipts, keep your head up, and when they try to move you, remember that the person who owns the building might just be sitting right next to you in coach. I stepped back from the mic, the noise of the crowd rising like the roar of those jet engines. I felt a hand on my arm. This time it was Marcus, giving me a supportive nod. "We did it, sir," he said. "We started it." "Marcus," I replied. "There's a difference." As I walked out of the building and toward the waiting car, I looked up at the Chicago sky. A plane was soaring overhead, its lights blinking against the purple dusk. I wondered who was sitting in seat 1A. I wondered if they felt safe. And I promised myself that as long as I was in charge, they would never have to wonder if they belonged. I'm sharing this with you today because we live in a world that tries to shrink us. It tries to make us quiet when we should be loud. It tries to make us move when we should stand our ground. If you've ever felt that hand on your shoulder, if you've ever been told to head to the back, I want you to know you're not alone. We are building something here, a community of people who refuse to be dismissed. If this story meant something to you, if it ignited something in your soul, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and most importantly, share your story in the comments. Tell me about a time you stood your ground. Tell me about a time you dropped your own bomb. Let's show the world that we are here. We are many, and we are not leaving. I'll see you in the next one. Keep flying high.